The spoiler this time is that there is no spoiler this time. Regular viewers have likely noticed that this video of mine came out of left field. I usually wait until the season is complete before doing a palate cleanser, like how I covered the villains from the 4 Scooby-Doo Renaissance films in between seasons of the new Scooby-Doo movies and the Scooby-Doo show. While the most popular request in the comments section was for me to next focus on the 3 Red Shirt Shaggy films from the mid-1980s, since then I've received an unexpected request from a very special someone who has supported me from the very beginning. This one's for you, sis. And spoilers for the following Scooby-Doo related episode. Scooby-Doo once rescued an eccentric southern millionaire from drowning and was remembered years later in the man's will. All the canine must do to inherit a fortune is spend one night in a spooky mansion. Because rich people just love making poor people jump through hoops for money. While stopped at a malt shop on their way to the will reading, the gang meet 2 men who introduce themselves as mystery solvers and ask to join the teenagers. Despite one of them clearly exhibiting inappropriate intentions toward Daphne, Fred invites them along.
Sure, Dean's all right, but that big lug, what a dummy. I thought big lugs were kinda your thing.
Poor Velma. Daphne will just never get it. Will she? Cosgood Creeps was a lawyer responsible for handling the estate of the late Colonel Beauregard Sanders, whose sole condition in his will was that his heirs had to spend a single night in the purportedly haunted family mansion. Creeps planned to cheat the legal inheritors out of their share of his client's fortune by dressing up as a green phantom to scare them out of the house before they could satisfy the terms of the late Colonel's final testament.
Cousin Simple, Nephew Knowable, Sweet Cousin Maldahide, Cousin Slicker, and my old friend Scooby-Doo. You're all going to receive an equal share of $1 million.
The money in question was said to be $1 million. While this was a modern remake of the classic Where Are You episode, A Night of Fright is No Delight, it's still likely set in the original timeline of 1969, since nothing that would rule that out appears on screen. Just the opposite, in fact. Not only are the gang seen eating at a classic malt shop replete with soda fountain and a waitress in mini shorts and huge collars, the only other vehicle seen on the road was a 1967 Chevy Impala. Considering how pristine that vehicle was, only further cements that this episode was set in the late 1960s. Thus, $1 million in 1969 would be worth almost $9 million today, making this an extremely lucrative scheme. And though not mentioned, it can be assumed that as the executor of the estate, Creeps would have final say of the dispensation of the money should there be no legal inheritors left to collect, allowing him to maintain control of the fortune and, presumably, award it to himself. This was a decent plan, all things considered. It wasn't particularly dangerous for the corrupt lawyer, as he wasn't putting himself in any physical danger, and should his scheme be uncovered, authorities would be hard-pressed to charge him with anything. Fraud, perhaps, but considering how eccentric the late Colonel was, Creeps could make a convincing case that his client had given him directions to do whatever he could to scare the heirs away. I wouldn't be surprised if Creeps had prepared such paperwork ahead of time, just in case his plans were thwarted. He was certainly acting unethically, but let's be blunt. Creeps was a lawyer, and that profession isn't exactly a breeding ground for morally upright citizens.
You're not a good guy at all.
I'm a lawyer, you idiots!
As this episode was a remake, I'm afraid there will be no points for originality. So despite the low-risk, high-reward nature of the villain's plot, I can't in good conscience award Creeps a design score any higher than a 3 out of 5. This version of the Green Ghost's costume was among the better ones featured in the franchise. While not much more intricate than a man wearing a mask and a sheet, Creeps utilized several special effects as well as realistic props and elaborate wirework to portray a convincing phantom. In addition to the robe, the mask Creeps wore was certainly frightening, with glowing yellow eyes and sharp, pointy fangs, not to mention the spindly claws reminiscent of talons. He also glowed, floated, and was able to walk through walls. All classic Scooby Ghost conventions.
What about the walking through the walls? And the bodies? Well, that was just a projector. As for the bodies...
Were they dummies filled with corn syrup?
Exactly!
In the original Where Are You episode, the bad guys used realistic dummies of the 4 other heirs to frighten away anyone who found them, making it appear as though the ghosts had permanently dealt with the cousins. This time around, the dummies were even more convincing, with creeps posing them as murder victims and going so far as to fill them with red corn syrup to simulate blood. Again, as this was a remake of an earlier episode, I'm going to have to knock the score down a bit to reflect that. The Green Ghost gets a 3 out of 5 for its outfit. By the end of the episode, all the other inheritors were nowhere to be found, indicating that Creeps managed to successfully drive away everyone but Scooby, so he had been very close to succeeding in his scheme.
He's dead, like really actually dead.
That's not good.
In addition to staging the deaths of some of the other Sanders family members, Creeps was also able to draw suspicion away from himself by staging his own death. Though just like when a villain fakes their own kidnapping, this would only raise questions later on when the supposedly dead family members start to emerge, presumably going back to their normal lives once they had recovered from being terrorized. It would also look very suspicious for the attorney who had been handling these matters to not only later be found alive himself, but $1 million richer. Then again, it could have been Creep's plan to disappear with the money and start a new life somewhere. The Colonel's fortune was enough to easily afford a very comfortable retirement.
But the joke is on him because the money's worthless. It's all Confederate dollars.
Oh well, easy come, easy go.
Little high, little low, any way the wind blows doesn't really... Sorry. I always think of Bohemian Rhapsody whenever anyone says those words. We eventually found out that the fortune was worthless, but Creeps didn't know that at the time, so it won't be counted against him. I can't help but wonder if the late Colonel Sanders knew the money he was leaving to his heirs wasn't legal tender, but he just wanted to screw with them. Setting aside however he felt about his family members, Scooby-Doo literally saved the Colonel's life, yet he still made the dog go through the trauma of spending a night in a haunted house along with everybody else. Thus, I wouldn't be surprised if the man had known all along his inheritors were going to be disappointed. He was a Confederate sympathizer after all, so we already know he was an asshole. Even if the cousins or Creeps never went home, it's highly likely a concerned family member would eventually call the authorities to do a wellness check at the Sanders mansion. All the bodies would be found, but it wouldn't take long for investigators to realize everything was fake. No matter how incompetent law enforcement is in the Scooby-Dooverse, even they likely wouldn't need an autopsy to identify fake blood. In addition to staging the deaths of the others mentioned in the will, the lawyer also assaulted the gang by brutally smashing Fred against the wall and tossing Shaggy out a window, which could have easily killed the teenager. The villain was not messing around and appreciated just how high the stakes were.
Hey, look! A clue! That's strange. I guess we both noticed that these toys are the only things up here that aren't covered in dust.
As for mistakes, Creeps didn't make very many. Apart from forgetting to replace the dust on the toys he had rigged to float, which made them stand out to Velma as clearly staged, he didn't leave much for the gang to work with, and it was only after Scooby managed to get him to fall through a trapdoor that the villain's plot unraveled. Almost succeeding in his scheme, and showing enough determination to resort to physical assault, all while leaving very few clues for the gang, Cosgood Creeps gets an operation score of 4 out of 5. This leaves this version of the Green Ghost with a final due score of 3.3 out of 5.
So, Daphne, old drafty house, let's say you and I bunk together.
Seriously, Daphne, stay away from this guy. I would like to take a moment to thank my new Patreon members and apologize in advance if I mispronounce any names. Reaper1399. Thank you, Reaper1399. Marius Gren. Thank you, Marius Gren. Thank you to everyone helping support my channel. It absolutely means the world to me. If you'd like to help, there's a link to my Patreon page below, but please only join if you're comfortable doing so. New members get a personal shout out in the next regular video I upload after they join, as well as credits in each regular video for as long as they remain a paid member. I would also like to share a new photo of a supporter wearing my merch. Thank you to Jeremy Welling, shown here wearing a Carl the Stuntman t-shirt. If you're interested in picking up some clothing or mugs, there's a link to my merch store below. If you send me a photo wearing or holding anything you buy, I would love to include it in my next regular video. This means you are giving me permission to share it if you send it to me. No takebacks. After saving his pawn shop from a rampaging giant dinosaur plushie, Dean and Sam Winchester receive a used television as a reward from the grateful owner. Little do they know that the TV is haunted, and the brothers are soon trapped in the animated world of Dean's favorite childhood cartoon show.
Take it easy. What? She's delicate. Go that way, I'll lead.
What?
More than anything else, the fact that it takes two of them to carry that TV while acting as if it's a major purchase really dates this episode. They walked out of that pawn shop like they were carrying the Ark of the Covenant, whereas these days, renters often leave their 60-inch flat screen behind simply because they don't want to bother unscrewing it from the wall of their apartment.
Great, so we're stuck in a cartoon with a talking dog.
The greatest talking dog in history. Now come on. Dibs on Daphne.
Character ages are difficult to pin down when it comes to TV shows, but canonically, Dean was born in 1979. This episode takes place in 2018, which would put him at close to 40. Daphne is 16. If anything, the real villain in this episode was Dean Winchester. A neighborhood developer named Jay, no last name given, owned a pocket knife haunted by the ghost of a young boy. When he wanted to buy a piece of real estate, he would hide the cursed object somewhere in the building and wait for the ghost to cause enough havoc to scare the owner into selling him their property at below market value.
What in the... holy heck...
Never buy anything from Moosylvania.
Exactly.
Was this a reference to the Rocky and Bullwinkle show? Moosylvania was a fictional island governed by Bullwinkle J. Moose, hence the name, and sandwiched between the United States and Canada, with neither nation wanting to claim it. For those unfamiliar with the classic 1960s animated series, Bullwinkle and Rocky the Flying Squirrel were two good guys whose lives were constantly put in danger by the series' villains, Boris Badenov and Natasha Fatale. As the two often employed explosives in their dastardly schemes, it's possible the joke Dean was trying to make was that buying stuff for Moosylvania was a bad idea because they would frequently blow up. Except Boris and Natasha weren't from Moosylvania. They were from Potsylvania, a fictional nation of dictators and spies, likely meant to be found somewhere in Eastern Europe based on the accents. As it would have made much more sense for Dean to have said, "Never buy anything from Potsylvania," I wonder if the writer just mixed up the two countries from the old cartoon, or they assumed people would remember Moosylvania more than Potsylvania. Before proceeding any further, I must disclose that, while my wife and daughter were huge fans of Supernatural, I never watched it myself. I have a passing familiarity that the series revolved around the Winchester brothers investigating ghosts and demons, and they had a friend who was an angel. Maybe. But that's about it. So if you're a fan of the show, and I say something that isn't true for the characters, or I miss a reference to something that's explained in an earlier episode, with the exception of a Google search here or there, everything I know about Dean and Sam is based solely on my observations of them in this single episode.
So, Daph, I usually don't have to do this, but what do you look for in a guy?
One of my observations being that Dean is a creep. Jay was essentially a classic Scooby villain insofar as he was apt to cheat others out of their land by resorting to supernatural shenanigans. Though unlike the cartoon villains, he didn't dress up as a ghost or monster himself, and the spirit featured on the show was genuine. Nevertheless, as this technically takes place in the real world, albeit a version of the real world where ghosts, demons, and angels actually exist. This episode will be judged a bit more harshly, as the producers can't use the excuse that it's just a Saturday morning cartoon show for kids to explain away sloppy writing. Perhaps it's because of my own background in the industry, but I can't help but wonder why the sellers of these allegedly haunted properties would exclusively sell them to Jay at below market value. One would think they would at least first try to see how many buyers they could attract by listing with a real estate agent and marketing through traditional methods. When asked why they were selling, the owners didn't have to disclose they were doing so due to a ghost. They could just say they were retiring, or moving to another state, or any other excuse other than being attacked by giant dinosaur plushies. In most states, sellers are required by law to disclose any adverse conditions of their property prior to sale. If, for example, their roof has a massive leak, or there are major plumbing or electrical issues, or the garage was built halfway over the neighboring property line, the seller would legally be required to make any potential buyers aware of these facts. There are exceptions to this rule when a seller is allowed to remain mum about something which might otherwise affect the value of a piece of real estate. Specifically, I'm talking about the concept of a stigmatized property. This usually refers to locations where something traumatic happened, typically a murder or otherwise messy death. While some buyers would naturally be hesitant to live in a murder house, others would be more than delighted to pay a lower price for a place to live, regardless of what may have happened there. The legal obligation to disclose any negative history of a piece of real estate varies around the United States. Indeed, most states don't even require this, though almost all do demand that a seller answers truthfully if asked specific questions. For example, a seller doesn't have to volunteer that the previous owner was a murderer, but must honestly admit it when asked, "Isn't this the house where the guy boiled and ate his parents?"
But now, that spirit is freed.
You think anyone's gonna believe that?
In the universe of the TV show Supernatural, presumably hauntings and demonic possession are as common as termites and radon gas. So it wouldn't be surprising if laws governing real estate transactions require disclosure of all supernatural shenanigans that occurred in any given structure prior to sale. However, the fact that Jay said nobody would believe them about the ghost child implies that, in this world, most rational people still don't believe in ghosts. So it's unlikely the law would specifically require disclosure of a haunting. It feels inevitable that at some point the previous owners of Jay's real estate holdings would compare notes and smell a rat. But even if they did, what recourse would they have? Or better yet for the villain, would they even want to admit being fooled by a guy who was allegedly using a ghost to carry out his evil deeds? Try filing that claim at your local Better Business Bureau. Really, the only risk to Jay was the ghost itself. If the spirit of the little boy had the ability to move physical objects enough to attack a grown man with a giant dinosaur plushie, why didn't he just snap Jay's neck and free himself? The ghost said he hated being used by the villain, but for some reason couldn't do anything to rectify the situation himself. It would have been helpful if the episode had explained how Jay maintained control over the spirit, but there was nothing to work with. Google says that humans on Supernatural control ghosts with magic or salt, and though salt was used by the Winchesters to eventually stop the Phantom, Jay is never seen doing anything other than holding the pocket knife. No magic, no salt. This lack of explanation had me wondering if perhaps the ability to control ghosts is so common on this show that they don't even bother explaining it by the 13th season. Kind of like how by the third Scooby series, they often never bother to explain how the villain made his ghost float or walk through walls. Regular Scooby viewers would just assume wires and a projector were involved, so perhaps regular Supernatural viewers would just assume salt or a binding spell were involved as well.
Let's do this!
Did you just get beat by a microvan?
The light was red! The light... Red!
The light was green. In addition to being a creep, Dean was a sore loser, too. As far as the design of this plan goes, it was mostly foolproof for the sleazy developer, and though hardly original for the Scooby-Doo universe, it had to have been fundamentally unique for the world of Supernatural. It was both lucrative and low risk, though we're forced to assume that's only because the villain had some sort of control over the ghost. Otherwise, this could have been extremely dangerous for him. And even if the sellers later found out they had been swindled, it would be difficult, or even impossible, to prove it to the authorities. Jay gets a 4.5 out of 5 for the design. The villain did not wear an outfit in this episode. Unlike how I argued in an earlier video that Ben Ravencroft's friendly persona was technically a disguise for his true nature as an evil warlock, Jay was a sleazy real estate developer and not only dressed like one, but acted like one as well, which included faking a friendly demeanor to hide his unethical greed. I should know. I've met a few real estate developers in my time. I'll just leave it here with a neutral 2.5 out of 5 and get to the next section. Setting aside the inherent danger of risking the wrath of a supernatural entity with the ability to bend the laws of time and space, just how did Jay typically follow up after his ghost wrecked his victim's property?
You see, he'd plant a haunted object, then let the ghost go to work.
And then it would possess something. Like a big dinosaur or a perfectly beautiful TV.
We saw Jay frantically rooting through the remains of the giant dinosaur plushie. Was that how he usually retrieved the cursed pocket knife? Or was this a situation where he panicked and had to act spontaneously to protect his scheme? The pawn shop haunting was the only time we saw the ghost in action in the real world, so we have no way of knowing how it performed earlier at other locations. Did Jay slip it inside objects at those places, or did he simply hide it behind a toilet in the restroom? I suppose it would depend on the businesses he was trying to ruin. It was said he owned a Chinese restaurant and a laundromat, and it's assumed the villain obtained those properties via his ghost child. So how would things have gone down in those locations? Did Jay hide the pocket knife in the restaurant kitchen, and the ghost child made the duck carcasses come to life to terrorize the cooks? Did he slip it inside the back of a washer, which then later spit out the clothes and water to frighten away customers? Or did those other buildings contain different businesses that Jay ruined, and his new renters came in with their own? Was the Chinese restaurant originally an Italian restaurant? Or the laundromat originally a small independent newspaper? I'm asking this for two reasons, because they both would have some impact on Jay's plot. An important part of his plan was obviously getting the cursed pocket knife back because he would need it for his next victim. If he hid it inside a piece of merchandise, like what he did at the pawn shop, not only would his plan fall apart if whatever he hid it in was sold before the owners were scared enough to sell their building, but Jay also risked losing the pocket knife forever. This is what happened after the villain slipped it inside the TV the Winchesters took from the pawn shop. Jay had only ever met the brothers that night and had no idea where they lived. For all he knew, their home could be across the country, and they only happened to be in town that night. It would have made much more sense for him to simply hide the pocket knife somewhere on the property and let the ghost do its thing. But as far as we knew, that wasn't how it worked. Perhaps the only way the ghost child could act was if he was inside another object. If that was the case, Jay should have only picked items for the ghost to possess that wouldn't be removed from the store, like a vending machine or a lamp. If the ghost boy had the power to transport human beings into the world of a cartoon show, I imagine shooting soda cans like a cannon or making electricity shoot out of a light fixture would be child's play. God, that sucked. It's likely the Winchesters' unexpected interference caused Jay to panic. He was probably able to usually retrieve the pocket knife at his leisure, but after the giant dinosaur plushie exploded, he desperately searched the remains for it. Though I question how the pocket knife even survived. Sam eventually destroyed it with a blowtorch, but Dean set the plushie on fire at the beginning with magic oil. That, or the subsequent explosion, should have been able to damage the knife enough to free the ghost.
You shake and shiver. You know we got a mystery that's also Scooby-Doo, be ready for...
She's 16. Dean is a creep. The other significant problem with Jay's plan was the same reason why he was able to buy all this real estate so cheaply. Stigmatized property. If he ruined the reputation of a building enough that the owner was forced to sell it, why would anyone want to move their business there? Even if they didn't mind the possibility of dealing with a vengeful spirit in exchange for cheap rent, would customers want to visit a place where they risked getting assaulted by a ghost? One of my jobs is answering online reviews, so believe me when I say that if something violent happens at a business, the general public will take notice. Regarding Jay's choices of which objects to have his ghost possess, Why did he originally stick it inside the giant dinosaur plushie and not the TV if he thought the latter would be enough to later silence the Winchester brothers? Did he even know how the ghost would use the device to begin with? It's understandable that a human-sized toy could be animated and cause physical harm, but how could Jay have known the ghost would have been able to suck people inside itself, transporting them to another world like the laziest of isekais? The villain may have had no idea what would happen and just expected the TV to fly at the brothers and pummel them to death, or electrocute them, or strangle them with the power cord. In the end, it was fortunate for Jay that he didn't use the TV originally, because that would have tossed a major monkey wrench into his scheme. He needed the pawn shop owner to be around to sell the property. If the man had gone missing, it could take years for him to be declared legally dead and for his estate to sell his assets. That's presuming the owner had next of kin and owned the building outright. If not, Jay would have to wait until enough delinquent taxes built up for the local government to foreclose on the real estate and sell it at tax sale, at which time there could be any number of competing bidders driving up the price. And if there were family members to handle the missing owner's obligations, they might be tempted simply to close the business, sell all the items inside, and put the building on the market. This would not only put Jay at risk of losing his cursed pocket knife, but also greatly reduce the odds of getting the place at below market value. Ultimately, Jay did a poor job of maximizing the profit potential of the ghost child. He somehow controlled a supernatural being with the ability to bend the laws of time and space, but building a medium-sized real estate portfolio was the best he could come up with? Even what we saw in the episode had enough profit potential to make Jay's meager holdings look like plastic houses in a Monopoly box. Imagine how much money one could make being able to transport people into the world of their favorite television shows. The possibilities are endless. Sick people could pay to go to the world of Dr. House and get a perfect diagnosis for whatever ailed them. Sci-fi fans could ride on actual starships in the middle of intense space battles, secure in their own safety because they were hanging around the most important characters in the show. Why go to Disneyland when you could visit the real Pandora? The biggest issue with this idea, of course, is how would Jay make it worthwhile for the ghost to keep these trips safe for the tourists, as all the child desired was to be freed from the cursed object so he could see his dad again. The villain's control appeared limited to having the boy act violently, so he probably couldn't fine-tune what the ghost could or would do. This also doesn't take into consideration the inherent danger to anyone trapped in the TV. What happens if you're inside and it's turned off? If your soul is in another dimension reached via a gateway generated by the device, you might be trapped on the other side forever. But at least you'd be alive. However, what if you're actually trapped within the circuitry of the TV itself? If the power gets interrupted, would you cease to exist? Or would you be in stasis until someone turns it on again, with no concept of how much time had passed?
3 million years!
This is worse than what the gang experienced in Cyberchase, because at least in that film, there was a possibility they existed on a hard drive or a mainframe somewhere. If the computer that trapped them was shut off, they could still be safe. There's nothing like that here for the Winchester brothers.
But that's why we hacked your financials. Turns out you're not so big on paying your taxes, are you?
Good enough for Capone, good enough for you.
I would have gotten away with it if it wasn't for those meddling kids. Ooh, he said it. He said the line.
Finally, what may be the biggest mistake made by Jay was entirely unrelated to his actions seen in the episode. Not paying his taxes. As alluded to by Dean, despite all the murder and extortion and gambling and all the other crimes he was so obviously guilty of, notorious gangster Al Capone was eventually brought to justice for not paying taxes on all the money his criminal empire had earned him. It's like getting caught speeding while you're transporting illegal contraband on the highway. Here's a public service announcement. Try not to commit a petty crime when you're already in the middle of committing a much more valuable one. It is nevertheless very improbable how everything transpired on the show. For starters, except in exceedingly rare circumstances, the local police do not arrest tax evaders. The IRS has its own division to investigate and take into custody those guilty of tax crimes. And even then, that's not their first step. It's difficult for many of us to accept, having grown up under the illusion that bad people who commit crimes go to jail when caught, but the IRS is usually more concerned about collecting taxes than punishing those who skirt the law. When notified of a potential tax cheat, if deemed credible, the IRS will launch an investigation which could take weeks or months, Certainly not a day or two as seen in the episode. If they find that a taxpayer hasn't paid what's owed, the collection process usually begins with certified letters warning of the delinquency to try and compel the taxpayer to voluntarily bring their account current. This almost certainly will include penalties and interest, but often no prison time. If the taxpayer still doesn't make things right, then the IRS will turn up the heat by filing liens and seizing property. When people do go to prison for tax evasion, it's usually because they refuse to even attempt to make things right with the IRS. This is why Wesley Snipes, who fought his tax evasion charges by essentially using the same kind of legal reasoning sovereign citizens use when they get pulled over for not having valid license plates, served 2 years of a 3-year sentence in federal prison. Compare this to Willie Nelson, who begrudgingly cooperated with authorities after he was caught not paying his taxes and was allowed to remain free to perform concerts to earn enough to resolve his debt. As seen in the Snipes case, even when prison is involved, the sentences are relatively light and often reduced during incarceration. Worst case scenario, provided he cooperated and wasn't guilty of previous offenses, Jay could be looking at less than a year behind bars. Even if all his assets were seized by the government, as long as it was enough to satisfy the tax debt, the villain could have a nearly clean financial slate upon release. Even if we disregard how the IRS typically handles cases like Jay's, looking at just the criminal charges against him, the evidence the authorities had to make the arrest was obtained via illegal hacking by the Winchesters. There is a very good chance that the case would be tossed for lack of admissible evidence. You can tell this episode was inspired by Scooby-Doo, considering the protagonists commit crimes while trying to solve a mystery. Jay was mostly successful at carrying out his scheme, as evidenced by him owning most of the neighborhood by the time the episode began. He was also ruthless enough to try and eliminate the Winchester brothers, who he had never met before, simply because they were snooping around the crime scene. However, he loses points for not keeping a cool head by impulsively slipping the cursed pocketknife into the television without knowing how the ghost would act, and for committing other crimes that allowed his minor real estate empire to crumble. He gets a 3 out of 5 for the operation. Sleazy real estate developer Jay gets a final due score of 3.3 out of 5.
So, I guess this is it.
This is what?
Shh. No words. We'll never know what could have been.
We'll never know what could have been. My guess would be a restraining order issued by Judge Mentok. And that's my ranking of the villains from the Scooby-Doo episode of Supernatural, shown here. I swear I did not plan for them to have identical scores. I also apologize if some of you were disappointed that I put my current video schedule on hold while I covered this episode. But come on, my baby sister asked for this. Hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. If you'd like to help support this channel, there's a link to my Patreon below, but please only join if you're comfortable doing so. Patreon members receive credit in my videos for as long as they remain a paid member, as well as a personal shout-out in the next regular video produced after they join. There's also a link to my merch store where you can pick up clothing or mugs. If you send me a photo wearing or holding anything you buy, I'd love to include it in my next regular video. This means you are giving me permission to share it if you send it to me. No takebacks. That Dean Winchester really is a creep. They did a good job when they cast Soldier Boy, didn't they?